Dr. Heble, AJ, thank you very much for this few minutes for Syncopa Blues. So, you are musicians, but also you are a theoretical academic and I don't know if promoter from a theoretical vision of jazz, but you wrote or you write very much about jazz and about context, about social impact of the jazz. So, in People Get Ready, a book you wrote and you coordinated. So, you talk about future of jazz. Does jazz have a future? Is my first question. Does jazz have a future in this 21st century?
That's a great question. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. Yes, the argument that we put forward, I co-edited that book, People Get Ready, The Future of Jazz is Now, with my colleague and friend Rob Wallace. And in that book, we do argue that jazz has a future and that the future is, in fact, now. I believe that the future of jazz resides in the ability of the music to traffic between cultures. So, if you think about some of the most exciting developments, to my mind, some of the most exciting developments that are taking place in the music right now involve music that is pushing the boundaries, that is moving beyond, beyond familiar boundaries, beyond traditional genres. In fact, much of it can't even be categorized in any easy way, right? This is music that resists any single easy routine classification according to genre, according to style, merging different traditions, different cultural traditions, but different musical traditions. So music that brings together more familiar styles of jazz with classical music or with hip hop or with world musics, different world music traditions from across the planet. Mm-hmm. So I think this is where the future of jazz, to me, resides in its ability to continue to push the borders, to look for innovation. I think, as my colleague George Lipsitz has written in his book Dangerous Crossroads, jazz has always been about relentless innovation, not about static tradition. So despite the kind of the belief of maybe the Wynton Marsalises and the Ken Burns of the world who, through their work, try to return us to a particular traditional view of jazz, I think the argument that I would put forward, and it's the one that George Lipsitz makes in that book, Dangerous Crossroads, is that jazz is always about pushing things forward. It's about innovation. It's about trying to push boundaries and not about remaining static, about remaining fixed. It's always about pushing for innovation. To me, that's the most exciting stuff that's going on in jazz, and I believe very much that jazz does have a future and that the future is now. We're seeing it very much articulated and expressed in so much of the music that is happening around the world right now.
The jazz, there's no future of jazz because the future is constantly changing or making. What do you think about it? I don't know.
I think I think again the argument we make is the future is happening now. So it's evident in the music that is happening all around us that there is innovation. It's always been there, right? So I think it's wrong to argue that jazz is this kind of static thing. If you look at many kind of institutions that promote jazz, like educational institutions, there's this kind of institutionalized version of jazz history that revolves around a particular tradition, which right now is basically focused on bebop or post-bop, right? So the institutions, for example, that the educational institutions that are involved in teaching the music to our young generation, most of them are focused on bebop. And if you think about bebop, in its day, when Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and others were playing bebop, it was a radical music. But now it's become de-radicalized. It's become almost conventional, traditional, right? So, I think we always have to look I mean, my interest, I mean, I love bebop, I'm happy to listen to it, but I'm not sure that that's what I would want the young generation, the new generation of musicians to be learning or to be playing. You know, it's great, but I think there's so much more stuff that's going on that people ought to be encouraged to recognize. And part of the issue, I think, is that many of the institutions, I'm speaking generally now, right?
Yeah.
And many of the institutions that educate around jazz have a very kind of what I would see as a kind of conservative bent, that they're looking towards, you know, preserving that traditional element, which is now, you know, again, at the time it was a more radical form of music making, bebop, but it's now become more orthodox, more traditional. And I think the best music, for me, not for everyone, but for me, the best music is music that resists settling into a kind of orthodoxy, which is why, of course, I love improvisation.
So, you say when born bebop, it was a radical music or radical jazz.
Yeah.
When Ornette Coleman and
Exactly.
Cecil Taylor
Exactly.
play a free jazz, and in the beginning of 60s,
Yes.
so middles of 60s, and
Yeah.
John Coltrane was a radical jazz musicians.
That's right.
So this point take me to your investigation. So the improvisation, that particular music or that particular jazz of that or time,
Yes.
necessarily talk us about our context and about our social context.
Yep.
It's
Yes, I think it does. I mean, I think that many of the musicians with whom I've worked over the years in my role as the founding artistic director of the Guelph Jazz Festival, you know, in that role I've come to know many musicians and come to work very closely with many of those musicians, and so many of them are very articulate in expressing the importance of the social contexts for their music making. They strongly believe that the music that they are performing has a powerful social force. So I'm thinking of artists like, you know, perhaps most notably artists like William Parker and people associated with, you know, the scene in New York City that William Parker is one of the key players in. You know, these are artists who I think, you know, they're associated with the Vision Festival in New York, and the Vision Festival also has a very powerful social mandate. Mm-hmm. You know, so I think these are artists who are very articulate about expressing the need to think about their music making in the context of broader social struggles. You know, they're aware of issues that are taking place in the world around them. You know, William Parker has said, in order to survive, we must keep hope alive. And I believe that he's saying that hope is an absolute necessity in the face of the degradations that threaten to beset aggrieved populations all around the globe. And I think it's a very powerful slogan, and it's articulated throughout William Parker's music and the music of many of the people in his circle. Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, you're right to suggest that kind of social purpose was evident in many of the, you know, free jazz artists from the 1960s. Archie Shepp, very notably, was extremely outspoken in seeing his music as a social, you know, as kind of linked with social activism. And, you know, the Art Ensemble of Chicago in their own way, you know, who sought to take control over the means of production to be able to, and Sun Ra, these are all artists from that period who I think in many ways were thinking about their music in terms of broader social issues. And I think that carries over into, perhaps in a slightly different way, but I think that carries over into the kinds of arguments that we're seeing being articulated by many of the musicians on the free jazz and improvised music scene today.
Okay. Well, in People Get Ready, you say also, jazz does not have to go to anywhere.
It's already there.
It's already there.
Exactly, yeah.
But it's still moving.
It's still moving.
But it's still moving.
It's always been moving.
Keep moving all the time.
Yeah.
So, what are the roads or the ways of jazz in this time?
I think it goes back to something I said earlier, right? That the ways for jazz to be the future now, and you're right, jazz is always moving. it's never been static. I mean, the best jazz has never,
Yeah.
in my mind, right? Again, I'm speaking.
I agree with you.
These are my perspectives. Not everyone is going to agree with this, but for me, the jazz that I find most provocative, most interesting, is jazz that's, as I said earlier, pushing the boundaries. And so, the road for jazz to take is the open road rather than the closed road. So, you know, Herman Gray, in his book Cultural Moves, he's a sociologist, talks about it's been a while since I read it, but I think he talks about the road and street metaphor, and he talks about kind of the open road of jazz as opposed to the closed road. I think that's an interesting metaphor because it's that kind of openness that remains really important rather than being fixed. So the openness to incorporate other traditions, the openness to incorporate other genres. So rather than to say jazz has to be this, why can't jazz be a mix of things, right? You know, and I think that one of the things that I've encountered over the years in doing the Guelph Jazz Festival is people would say, well, is that jazz when you have jazz combining with hip hop or jazz combining with classical music? But I think the most interesting music is actually music that is challenging those definitional categories, that's raising questions about genre. So to me, that it's the road for jazz is the open road. It's the one that keeps asking questions and refuses to settle into any kind of orthodoxy.
That I'm totally agree with this concept. There are space to two different concepts of jazz. You say you say Wynton Marsalis, and all we know that Wynton Marsalis is more traditional in this concept, but there are space for cohabit two different perspectives of jazz or whatever.
I think so. I certainly love bebop. I have no issues with bebop, but I do have issues when people like Wynton Marsalis or Ken Burns pay short shrift to the history of jazz that is not being promulgated by dominant perspectives. So, if you look at Ken Burns' History of Jazz, 10-part documentary, the amount of time that is dedicated to the kind of free jazz movement is very short, very small. And there are moments in that documentary that seem to me to be very insulting to some of those artists. So I think, there's one moment that I recall where I think you get this very, it's again been a while since I've seen it, but I think you get this, I'm remembering there's this very intense moment of Cecil Taylor playing free jazz. Mm-hmm. And then Branford Marsalis, who usually is pretty open and receptive, but he makes some really offhand comment that says something like, I think his comment is something like, Cecil Taylor thinks that audiences need to prepare to hear his music, and that's totally wrong. Or like he dismisses it offhand, and I think, no, that's not, you shouldn't be dismissing this. This is an important point. Mm-hmm. And that's basically the moment that's devoted to free jazz in that 10-part documentary. So it's just that, basically it's dismissed from the voice of the people who represent the dominant perspective, the Marsalises, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that the issue I have is not with bebop or with traditional music. It's just when traditional music is being favored in a way that pays short shrift to other histories and perspectives that have been equally vital in the history of the music or in the, in the unfolding of jazz. That's my concern. So your question is it possible for the two to cohabit? Of course it is. Of course it is.
But I thought don't try to force or impose one of
well, or
them.
it's okay to have a perspective, mm-hmm. but don't in a documentary that purports to be about the history of jazz, right?
Right.
It's not like a documentary about the traditional history of jazz. It's supposed to be a 10 parts. It's not like 1 hour. It's like 10 parts.
10 hours.
Yeah. It's this massive documentary to only pay that little attention to free jazz seems to me to be pretty problematic.
Yeah.
And then to dismiss it right?
Correct.
I mean, it would be fine if it was like actually represented in a positive manner, and to say, and to acknowledge that yes, this documentary is coming from a particular perspective, and that there are other perspectives that are equally important but aren't being represented here.
Yeah.
Something like there are ways to do it that would have been, I think, more effective.
Of course. So, in this minutes, you talk about the jazz in the '60s and the resistance and the protest and the activism from a few musicians of the time.
Yeah.
At that time. So. I'm really think that the music and the jazz particularly, it's a kind of tool, of very powerful tool to an activism, to protest against I don't know, everything, the social, the human rights,
Yeah.
something. So in this time of Trump era.
Yeah.
So migrations in Africa, diasporas. So what is the form that take that music in this time? I don't know if I repeat the question, but taking the resistance, take the protest. So I don't know. What do you see in this time with so chaos around the world?
No, that's a really important question, and it's one that I've thought about a lot, and it's one that I've written about in a number of my books. So in The Fierce Urgency of Now, which is a book on improvisation and human rights, a book that I co-authored with Daniel Fischlin and George Lipsitz. We present an argument about the role that improvisation has played for artists struggling for human rights and social justice. So, we live in an era when diverse peoples and communities of interest are struggling. They're struggling to forge alliances and affiliations.